Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Luis. Thank you so much for being here. It's awesome to see a full room, and it makes me feel even more sacrificial than before, considering I'm doing a live demo pretty much after my 5 slides. So just a few questions for demographic purposes. Just curious to know how many people here have already managed Windows servers in the past? Okay, lots of you. How many people just get to buy into an AD server but know nothing else about it? Okay, so the idea today really was, in the last few years, my consulting company in Vancouver, we've done a lot of work with Windows servers and helping some of our clients move to a Windows-based infrastructure simply because there was just nicer hardware to use for enterprise or business-grade purposes. And what we found out was it was actually a very stable platform, very easy to work with, and reliable and easily supportable, lots of availability. So this is our agenda for today. In no particular order, just the bullet points look really nice in the template. We're going to build an AD. We're going to build a DNS server, file server. We're going to set up a Mac virtual machine to do a network home directory login once all that's set up. And configure network policy server for radius authentication, which might be helpful in a situation where you have a switch where you don't want to just allow anybody on the network and want to do network-based authentication, 802.1x. As well as set up VPN services that will allow a Mac to connect with L2TP over IPSec. And believe it or not, we're going to demo all that live right here, right now. So why Windows is one of the questions that people that I have this conversation about often ask me. And so I have, I thought about it, and these are some of the reasons. It's definitely a mature product. It's been around for a long time. There's a roadmap to speak of, which all of us know in the Apple world, we just sort of hang on to our hats and just hope for the best every time there's a new product announcement. Anybody that was not surprised by the demise of the Xserve? Didn't think so. Excellent. Hardware support, as well as integration into lots of other tools. It's such a widely used platform that you can find tools to integrate with just about anything, whether it's your Google Apps directory integrated with AD to anything else, really. So without any further ado, what I thought is we just step right into the demo. Forgive me for sitting, but all right. So what I did is I built this in parallels. I just have a Windows Server 2012 download that I installed, and all I've done ahead of time is just do the install updates, and put a static IP address on the machine. That's all I've done so far. The 10.8 machine, I've done the same. I've just done an install of 10.8 and install the updates, and I think it has a static IP address as well. And that's it. And they're both gonna talk to each other within the private Parallels network that my Parallels creates for me. Let's power these guys on. Let's see if this will actually resize. There we go. Is that legible? Yeah. Hopefully some of the tools will actually work with this resolution. We'll see. We'll find out very soon. So in Windows Server, really almost everything can be set up initially with Server Manager. The Server Manager does start up automatically whenever you log in, which can be a little bit of a pain. So I typically disable that right away by having it not start. So this may be tricky to scroll around. Let me see if I can change my resolution here.
You can use a finer resolution. I brought my glasses this time.
Let's see if that actually fits in the screen. Not sure if that's going to be supported there or not. Right. Okay, we can probably make do with that. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to add roles and services, and I actually put together a little sort of task list of what we're going to do, and I'm happy to make this available as well. I'll put it up on my website and leave a link for you guys before we leave the session today. So I did these 3 things ahead of time, and one thing that you want to do if you're doing a test setup in VMware or in Parallels, so one of the things that happens is Parallels does sort of an automated setup where it creates an account that automatically logs you into Windows. However, to be able to configure a server as an AD controller, you have to have an account that requires a password for login. It will not let you proceed if it's set to automatically log in, even if there's a password on the account. So that little command there, net user administrator password required yes, will essentially turn off that auto login. We're going to add the roles. We're going to add some features and some role services. We'll promote the server to an AD controller. DNS gets automatically provisioned as a result of setting up AD. And so we'll do a couple of things there. We'll organize the AD OUs just to my liking. It's just sort of the best practice that I've adopted over the years to organize an AD setup so that we don't have just one big container with everything. Then we'll configure VPN services, web services with a self-certificate, et cetera, et cetera. We'll just start walking through this setup now. So we're going to add roles and services, and let's just see if this will actually work for us or not. This is going to be tricky. Is there our room proctors, is there anything we can do about the can we get it to a bit larger resolution by any chance, finer resolution?
You can't put the res in your VM.
Let me see. Let's try. I don't think so. Yeah, it just reverted back. I think it might force itself onto the... Yeah. Parallel stools... The virtual machine settings, yeah. Yeah, not finding it. I might need to do a restart there. Just restart this VM just in case. Oh, maybe there. It just took. That looks better. That was not me. All right. Okay, this we can work with. Is that still legible for everybody? All right. Okay, let's go ahead and do this. Add roles and features. So we're going to go ahead and add all the little bits and pieces we're going to need to set up. If you've never seen this add roles and features wizard, essentially just takes you step by step into adding all the functions that you might need. We are just, in Server 2012, Server Manager has the ability to manage other servers as well. So what you see here is the ability to pick which server you're going to manage. And we could have added a remote server to do this with. In the case that you have installed Server 2012 with the core functionality only. Core functionality essentially lacks a GUI, which means you have to do remote management in this managed, or use command line to manage it. So we're going to set up AD, Active Directory, directory services, domain services, and there's a few features that get added as a result. Most of them management, an Active Directory module for PowerShell, so you can do PowerShell commands. We're also going to do a DNS server. We're also going to add some file services. We're going to need the network policy server. We're going to use remote access as well. And the web server we're going to light up because the web server is probably the easiest way to create a self-signed certificate. Once you have the IIS manager in place, you can launch it to create a self-signed certificate that you can use for Radius. Radius requires a self-signed cert to identify the server.
What if you already have a cert?
If you already have a cert, then you would just use that. You can actually import it with the server certificates often, but IIS Manager is still the easiest way to do that, or through the MMS snap-in with certificates. You'd import it into the personal store. Under features, which comes next, we're also going to add a couple of extra things. So some features have been enabled now automatically as a result of selecting some of the roles in the previous screen, like group policy, the remote server admin tools, and others. One thing I'd like to always add is the Telnet client. That gives you the ability to use Telnet from the command line, which is not there by default. We're also going to use the Windows Search Service, which when we install ExtremeZ-IP, it requires the Windows Search Service in order to enable Spotlight functionality. And that's about it as far as roles and features are concerned. Gives you a few explanations about some of the things that are going to be happening once this is deployed. And so far, none of these features actually require a reboot. So this gets all done live on the spot, and we'll just go ahead and do that. DNS, one of the gotchas with DNS is that when you light up an AD controller, if you don't manually configure DNS or don't have that pre-configured, it'll want to create the DNS service for you automatically. And one of the things that Windows does is that it does not create a reverse zone automatically for your private namespace. So one of the first things you want to check when deploying AD is to make sure your DNS server is, has a reverse zone. I would say that unless you know all the magic that Windows is doing in DNS, just don't fight it and just let Windows do the DNS, because it's actually a very powerful DNS server. If you insist on having DNS on a Mac, maybe just use it as a secondary server for redundancy, things like that. But definitely there's a lot of SRV records and things that get done on the Windows side that people forget about when they go and do it on the Mac. Oh, I already have DNS server, let's just create the forward and reverse records for the server, and they think all that's needed, but that's not so. All right, network policy server. It's again installed some of the network policy server features and services. Talks about remote access as well. Role services, we are going to turn on direct access and VPN. And that's it. Gives us, again, a web services role configuration option to add additional tools. We just want the defaults at this point. And a confirmation page of everything we're doing. That's going to take a few moments. You know, Windows is especially known for wizards. Right-click, create anything, basically, in Windows. And it kind of remains true in Server 2012. I have found it, once you understand how the features and roles are organized or where to find them and how to manage them, it's actually very simple to start services, to find their management tools and everything else. So this is already offering me the ability to close the server manager. And in here, it'll just come up and tell me when it's ready. Any questions so far? Please, by all means, at any time, just raise your hand and we'll answer any questions you have as we go along. So in a minute, we'll just get a little caution sign offering us to do a couple things. It'll essentially tell me, yeah, AD requires further configuration. You can now promote the server to be an AD controller. And we'll look at that. Let's look at some of the settings that I've changed ahead of time. Well, that's happening. So I'm going to look at the properties for the Mac or for the server here. I've changed the computer name to AD01. And I'm going to use a namespace of psu.windemo.private for our purposes today, which gets set when we create or configure AD. So in a minute, right now we have a local administrator account. I should probably run that other command. Oh, great. That's because I'm logged in as Luis. I'll wait for the tools to finish their install here. Yeah, I can, yeah. I was going to log in as administrator, but... Not if I'm an administrator, but let's launch the command prompt as administrator. Alrighty. I might also go set a password. And just so I don't forget that, I might go put that into Monkey Box.
Well, it's just dot.
What's that? No, actually, it requires certain security automatically, Windows Server. So I'd have to go into the group policy editor to disable the required password security features. So I also may not be online. No matter. Don't need the internet. Yeah, it takes a couple minutes installing all those features and roles. So we went at our consulting company from managing things, mostly avoiding in-house or on-premises servers of any kind, to joining the Microsoft Partner Network and getting, for $500 a year, access to internal use licenses of just about everything. including Exchange server and Windows server and so on. So we bought a little Dell server, and that's what we've been running our back end on. It's a little T310 single processor machine with about 48 gigs of RAM. And on that, we run about 8 VMs, including Federation services to tie into our free Office 365 subscription. All this, again, part of the Microsoft Partner Network benefits. We also have a VM for our Windows monitoring, remote management and monitoring tool, which is Kaseya. We run a VM for AD. We run a VM for file services. What else? We have a Linux VM for Splunk server. Things like that. And it just runs like a champ.
So while we've got a second here, can you talk a little bit about licensing costs? I mean, it's one of those places where you always hear the horror stories about dealing with Microsoft cows.
Yeah,
can
so
you talk a little bit about AD licensing in this particular case?
and I think a lot of the fear comes from the misunderstanding of how the licensing works. In the Windows Server world, a server license, you pay about $1,100 in Canadian dollars, probably about $9.99 or $1,000 in US dollars for a server license, which is 2 seats of a server install. But that also gives you the ability to deploy a third bare metal install for the purpose of running Hyper-V only, and that allows you to do virtualization with the single license. So you can deploy that one install with Hyper-V role installed, but nothing else, and then you can have 2 additional VMs. That cost does not include licensing CALs, and so the way CALs work is every user that's going to connect to the service or the server needs a CAL, and that CAL can be either a user CAL or it can be a device CAL. What user CALs allow you to do is that if you have a finite number of users, but a necessarily or an unknown number of devices, it allows you to not have to pay per device. But the reverse situation is also possible, where you have maybe a shop with 10 computers, but you have 500 people that rotate using those 10 computers, a lab, for instance. So in the case of a lab, you'd only need to buy 10 device CALs, and that would cover any user hopping onto those devices. The CALs can cost anywhere, I think, $30 a CAL. And it's one-time purchase for the CALs for that version of the OS. So for example, if you bought 2008 CALs, for Server 2012, you'd have to buy 2012 CALs. But then there's also the R2 revisions. The R2 revisions do not require a new purchase of CALs. So there's our little caution sign telling us that the install was done and that some configuration is required. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and promote this server to a domain controller. So here we get another wizard. Surprise, surprise. And we're going to call this psu windemo.private. Add a new forest, actually, is what we want. I have the option of joining an existing domain as another domain controller. Creating a new domain to an existing forest. And I've seen situations in universities where they allow a department to essentially run their own infrastructure off of the parent Windows domain. And so that's essentially a new domain in the forest. So that they can use their own subdomain name or whatever it is for their AD. In the old days, Microsoft used to suggest and recommend using the .local namespace for servers, and that has largely gone away. They now suggest using a corp subdomain of whatever your publicly routable domain namespace is. So if you're ook.co, then we, for example, our AD namespace is corp.ook.co. And that just makes for safer transitions into routable services. So we're going to create a new domain name. Say again? That's right, yeah. Although I don't know, I never personally had issues with that. So in this screen, we get to choose what the functionality of this domain will be. And if you have other domain controllers in your network that are running older versions of AD, this is where you might allow the forest to have compatibility all the way back to 2008 or 2008 R2. Otherwise, you won't be able to join any other servers to this domain unless they're on 2012 R2. And so for our purposes right now, we're just going to stay on 2012 R2. It also wants a directory services restore mode password. Oh, I didn't type that password. There we go. So here it's telling me that delegation for DNS cannot be created because there is no authoritative private zone. So it's actually going to go ahead and create that for us as a result. Now this is one screen that people often skip by, and because it'll use like ad01.psu.windemo.private as, or PSU Windemo right now as the NetBIOS domain name, not realizing that that's what users will type before their username and the backslash. So this is a good place to think about what you want your NetBIOS name to be. Typically shorter is better because it just makes it easier for users to remember. So in this case, I might just say PSU. These are all okay as the defaults. This is where it's going to store all the information. It gives you a summary again of all that's going to happen. Notice the DNS server option is selected there. So here's that local account administrator becomes the domain administrator when you create. So what we need to do is run that command for the other administrator as well. This may require that I restart the wizard to actually let it read that. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. Now that we've done the explanation, I'll be able to breeze through it on the next attempt. Just do a quick restart. That's what we wanted. We wanted to not allow us to log in automatically. Oh. I need to set a password for admin as well. So here, it again recognizes that AD, it is a domain controller, but AD is not configured yet. So we'll go ahead and run that promote. Okay, so hopefully here we won't have any issues with prereqs now. And after becoming a domain controller, it will require a restart. There we go. So a couple of things are caution. Cryptography issues with Windows NT4, we're not going to worry about that at the moment. The delegation for DNS, again, that happens after the DNS service is created anyways. And everything else passes. We're going to go ahead and install. So that takes a few moments, and we'll restart as well. Magic Triangle users? A few? So not as many, maybe just not raising your hands, but Mac users? Exactly. So Magic Triangle is still very much the something that's used a lot. Bind to an AD server for authentication, bind to a Mac server for MCX. And there is still the ability to extend the schema of AD, and with Workgroup Manager, you can connect to the AD server and manage the MCX directly onto AD. So if you've never done that, you might have an upstream battle trying to get your AD team wherever you work to even let you say the word schema extension. So we did it with a school in Vancouver, and they have since successfully been managing their MCX directly in AD with the Workgroup Manager. So that was a successful scenario. We used actually Tim Perfit was who gave a session about this at Apple Connect in Toronto. And he had already done all the scripts that did the LDIF exports, to import into AD to extend the schema, and it actually worked pretty well. Anybody done schema extensions before? A couple of people. It works okay? And you're managing AD and MCX directly in AD, rather? Okay. So far, so good, though? Yeah, the only caveat with schema extensions is that any upgrade to Windows could potentially break that. So you may need just to redeploy the work you did. So when you convert a server from just a standalone Windows server to an AD controller, the local account becomes the AD administrative account. So now notice that we're logging in as a PSU account. And this is the NetBIOS name I was talking about earlier. You don't want that to all of a sudden be some longish name that you can actually later not change. So. Right, so far so good. No lambs on the table yet. We're going to go ahead and launch Server Manager and look at what's going on. Let's see why this is complaining about no internet access. Well, my upstream connection from the Mac is not working, but it's irrelevant. At this point, we don't need the internet. But let's look at the settings here. We just have a static IP. That's the parallels created network. There is no DNS server at the moment, but the server will essentially point to itself as soon as we've configured DNS. And I'll go in and change that in a minute. All right, so let's go to DNS. And one way to get to all the management tools is from here. DNS Manager, for instance. Or you just search for the tool directly, and you can hit DNS Manager. So let's look at DNS real quick. Here's our server. Here's our forward zone. And here's our reverse zones. Notably, our reverse zone is missing. So let's go ahead and create a reverse zone for that. AD controllers have the ability to, between themselves, authenticate using AD magic and send each other updates for DNS, which is a great way to have redundancy for your DNS on your network, because if you add additional domain controllers, they'll, with the DNS servers, they'll automatically get the changes. It's great for redundancy. So that's easy way to do it. Just give you the prefix of the IPv4 address, and it's going to create the reverse zone automatically. That's it. So now that I've done the reverse zone, what I might do is go back into my forward zone and edit this particular record to make sure it has a PTR. So as soon as I do that, I'll be able to see that this now has a pointer record for the server. That's part of the reason we want to do that, is because Macs are very finicky about reverse records. So that's in place. Let's go. We can also, at the root level, we can configure other things like forwarders. So we might point it to wherever the upstream DNS is going to be, whether it's Google or some other server, your Comcast, friendly Comcast DNS provider, if you're adventurers. And we're going to go back into the server network and point it to itself for DNS. Oh, it's already there. I'll just add the other one for good measure. Server unknown. Let's do oh, there it is. It just came back with the results. Took a moment. ipconfig DNS flush DNS. So that flushes the resolver cache if you didn't have it configured before. Okay, so in our list of tasks, we've added all the roles, we've added all the features, we've promoted the server, we've done the reverse zone. Let's go and organize AD. So in Active Directory users and computers, you now have essentially your forest and your domain. And by default, everything is just in the specific OUs. But what I like to do is I like to create an OU for each organization or department or whatever is going to be linked in some kind of organizational way to how departments are organized. So I'll create a new organizational unit. We'll just call it PSU, for instance. And in here, I'll create additional OUs like users, groups. One thing I like to do is also create an OU called roles. And roles is really useful for things like service accounts. Let's say you're going to do radius authentication with Meraki, and Meraki wants to have its own admin account to authenticate users with. That's what we consider a role account, and we don't want that sitting inside of the users list with actual people. So that's just an organizational thing to do that helps keep things sane as they grow. We also like to separate servers from computers in terms of where we look for them. Just easier to find in the organization of things. So that's really it. When we bind computers, we have the choice of entering the entire LDAP path and have them drop into computers, or we can just bind them. They'll show up here, and then we can move them into the correct OU. So you have both options. Does anybody use Centrify in the fields to do your binding? No? Centrify gives you the option to actually browse your LDAP structure and just pick the OU where you want to put the bind, which is really useful too. Okay, so we've done all this. Let's go ahead and add a test user. We'll just call it NHD test. I'm going to not require a password change and not expire it. In a minute, when we've configured shares, I'll come back and set a profile location for this user. And I'll also create a group. And I might just call it VPN users. And we'll add an HD. Okay. That's about all I need to do right now for users and groups. Let's go to IIS and create our self-signed certificate. So here's our primary server. If I go into server certificates, there's a create self-signed cert, ad01.psuwin.demo.private. Just goes to the personal certificate store, is fine. That's it. After this, I could actually uninstall the IIS service if I want, but it does require a reboot. So sometimes it's not necessary to take that away. There are also programs that are install a IIS or web-capable login screen for people to reset their own passwords, which can be really useful. There's tools for that. And I know a lot of people that use them in larger organizations to have to reduce the calls to tech support for password resets. Users can go in themselves and reset them as long as they have the ability to get access to a second email or something like that. We've done that. Let's go to remote access. So remote access, we're going to configure it. Now the options that you have for remote access are you can function in a NAT mode where the server has multiple NICs and it has a public NIC and it has a private NIC and it does all the NATing for you as well as all the DHCP and everything else. In our case, we're a flat network. We're purportedly just forwarding VPN ports to the server, and so we're just going to do a custom config where we just have a flat setup. Custom configuration. We just want to do VPN access. We don't want NAT or LAN routing. So it creates a network policy and connection request policy automatically in NPS. And so we'll go and look at that in a minute because it creates it, but it's disabled by default. That's it for remote access. We'll just go in and change a couple of the settings for VPN. And that's done. Now, one of the things that will happen when you create a routing and remote access setup on Windows Server is that you define a range of IPs that Windows Server is giving out to clients that connect over VPN. But one of the gotchas is that the server assigns itself another IP address. And what happens is it actually sticks it into DNS, and the server starts to advertise that address when it's looked up on the network. But it can't provide AD services or any other services on that other IP address. So one of the things that you need to do right away is to go back into DNS and remove that second A record. So we'll do that. It looked like it hasn't added it yet, but as soon as the network policies, or as soon as we make a connection and the servers advertise, it'll grab another IP here. So let's go over to NPS, Network Policy Server. Another gotcha, potentially to keep in mind, is that when you install routing and remote access, it by default adds the NPS service, or the NPS management tool, rather. But it doesn't add the network policy role or feature. And so you might have a tool that works here to configure services, but the service is actually not running because it has not been installed. So I've seen situations where people added routing and remote access, but forgot to actually take off the network policy server feature to turn on. So don't forget about that. So let's look at our policies. And here's the routing and remote access policy that was created by RAS automatically. Let's look at that. What was I just saying? Let's see. Say again? Let me go back and. Oh, that's right. So if you already have an existing Windows server and all of a sudden you're turning on remote routing and remote access, and that's all you've turned on in the roles and features installation, It'll actually install the NPS console for managing the NPS service, but it doesn't install the NPS service itself. So you have to make sure that you've added the NPS or network policy server service in the roles and features installation as well. So let's look at this policy here. And what it is just remote access server VPN and dial-up. There are some conditions. Right now it's essentially every day is allowed from midnight to midnight. And those are the basic settings. So look at the network policies. Notice here is the policy for Microsoft routing and remote access, and this one's disabled by default. So let's open that. We'll want to grant access. We're going to change a few things here. Now the conditions, I'm just going to remove this, and we're going to add a couple of things. We're going to add a user group. The VPN user group is going to be allowed. And there's a couple of things more we're going to add. The tunnel type and the NAS port type. So the tunnel type, and we're going to use ESP and L2TP. And we're going to add the NAS port type as well. And for this one, we want just a VPN. Constraints, this is fine. I don't believe any changes are required here. And that's really it. And that's now enabled. That policy will now grant access to VPN users connecting. And while we're in here, we can also configure radius capability. Now it actually has a really cool wizard to do that automatically with. So let's go ahead and do that. So configure network access policy. So the network connection method, we're just going to call it 802.1x wireless for an access point that will do a radius connection, for instance. And it'll just give a policy the name automatically. So here's where you can add your radius clients. If you're security conscious, you'll just add each device individually. For example, ap01.psu windemo.private with an IP address of whatever. Or you can just call it APs with 10.211.55.0 and just allow the whole subnet to do radius requests to the NPS server. You can also create a shared secret, which will be required on the AP as well in order to be able to initiate that conversation. Or you can create a template, and the templates can be created here. If you're going to add each device individually, each AP or each switch that's going to do a radius authentication to the server individually, you might want to create a template so that you can reuse that password automatically. Let's actually show that. So if I go here and I create a template for a shared secret, APs, and then I create the policy, add. Now we can actually apply that template automatically. For radius, again, user groups, you might want to create a user group for radius access or wireless access. Some people just allow everybody that's a domain user access. Obviously, if somebody leaves, you disable their account, and that immediately removes their ability to authenticate to wireless. So you may not necessarily want to specify a unique group, but rather just use domain users, because everybody would be a member of domain users. Notice it wants to use a certificate, so that's why we install that beforehand with IIS, because without a certificate, you can't actually configure radius. So that's definitely required. The EAP type depends on the vendor that you're using for your wireless. In the case of Meraki, I think it's just EAP TLS. So we can go back and make that change if necessary. One of the cool things about Network Policy Server is that you can also have it check for devices that are non-compliant with certain policies, like having antivirus or having certain things. That's called NAP, NAP, Network Access Protection. However, there are lots of devices that are not NAP capable, including Mac OS X, unless you're using a third-party tool that gives them NAP capability. Windows devices are all NAP capable by default, and so it can check to make sure you have antivirus, it can check to make sure you have the firewall turned on, things like that, before it allows you access to the network. So in our case, with Macs not having NAP capability, we're going to have a few policies that are created automatically, one that is for NAP, one that's for non-compliant or not NAP capable clients. So we'll look at that and we'll simply use just the one policy. This is the security health validator. For NAP ineligible computers, we're actually going to allow full access. And the auto remediation will essentially take a Windows device that's trying to connect to Radius, and if it detects it's missing one of those settings that are required, you can have it sent to a website where they can download their antivirus or download whatever, or a KB article. Oh, it looks like we lost our mic. Their KB article where they're told how to set up their firewall, for example, how to turn it on. And once the security health validator can check that that's there, it'll allow the device to actually authenticate on the network. So here, a summary page. Looks like it's a battery problem. Yep. One, two, check, 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 check. 1, 2, 3. All right, battery is green. So now if we go look at connection request policies, a new policy has been created for us. And if we look at network policies, you can now see the 3 policies that were created. One for devices that are compliant with NAP, one that aren't compliant with NAP, and then for any device that is not even NAP capable. And here's where you can say what they will do. So what we might want to do is just forget the other 2 for the time being. And just call this 802.1x policy. We can look at the settings, grant access. This is the settings that we can remove the NAP capability. The NAS port type, if it's a domain user, it's allowed. These are the EAP types, so we might add EAP, which is what Meraki requires, for instance. And that's it. We've configured our Radius service. Unfortunately, I don't have an AP or a switch to test Radius connection with, but that's the gist of the configuration. Really, nothing else is required. Under the connection request, we might also want to check to make sure that it's not going to send to remediation. Looks like it's not. So that's really all we have to do. We can restart the service. So we've done our RAS configuration. Let's enable shadow copy. A shadow copy in Server 2012 allows for a really cool functionality, which is the ability to have regular scheduled shadow copy creations, which allows you to revert a file to a previous version right from within the OS. And depending on the I/O that you have on that server, that may or may not be a good idea, but let's go to administration tools. Computer management. Shared folders. configure shadow copies. So for the C drive here, for this VM, I'm just going to enable shadow copies. And the default, I believe, is every 4 hours. Every 1 week. So what we could do is, at 7 a.m. every day it does a shadow copy, essentially. That gives you the ability to go to a file in the system and be able to do something like properties, previous versions, be able to restore a previous version of that file right from within the OS. So let's configure some shares. We're going to create a share for a homes directory, as well as a generic share that we'll connect to. So right from Server Manager, we're just going to go into File and Storage Services, Shares, and this is the quick and dirty way to do it. New share. Which server you're going to do that on? Just call it Homes. And it's going to put it at C:/shares/homes. We do want access-based enumeration. That's essentially what allows you to prevent people that don't have permission for that share to not see the folder even. Caching we don't need at this time. That's it. These are the default permissions. Create. We're also going to create a generic share. And here we can add share, add domain users, change and read. NTFS permissions actually should always be full control. And then you can create ACLs on the share afterwards. That's the best practices way of managing permissions on Windows servers. NTFS should be full access for everybody. And then you can further limit that with ACLs. I'm going to cancel that. Just next, and create. So we can go check that those two shares have been created. There they are. So now that those two shares are there, what I'll do is I'll install ExtremeZ-IP. Where are you? There it is. Two-second install, literally. Maybe 5. And then what you can do is simply migrate those SMB shares. That's the term ExtremeZ-IP uses. You're essentially enabling AFP on the existing SMB shares. That's it. We're going to launch ExtremeZip. It's going to want to start the service. We're going to add it to the Windows Firewall exception list. Actually, that's a good point. Right now, for our demo purposes, I'm going to go turn off the firewall. We don't need the print server. Here we are. So in ExtremeZ-IP, we're just going to simply migrate the SMB shares. There are a couple that we don't need, which are only required for Windows, which are netlogon and sysvol, so we can actually remove those from ExtremeZ-IP. And let's configure some global settings here. So the first thing we want to be able to allow is home directory support. We're going to use the profile home as a directory. I'm actually going to specifically say what the profile home directory is for each user. Print server we're not using. We could support Unix permissions and ACLs, which allows you to do, if you're using the native AD client in Mac OS X, this works okay. If you're using Centrify or other tools where they sort of change the user ID in the process of binding, then you can have problems where even though the user can log in, they all of a sudden don't have permissions to anything because there is a mismatch between the GUIDs, essentially. Because we're using native Mac OS X, this would be okay to use at the moment. There's an outstanding issue on the Centrify boards about that. I haven't checked back to see if that's there. And we're going to add the administrator account here to make sure that it can check for ACLs. Yes, yeah. Successful test, apply. We will need to restart the services. We'll do that in a second. We are going to enable Spotlight Search, which requires the Windows Search Service. This would have warned me that Windows Search Service is required if I had not turned it on. And that's it. How your server appears to the network is, this is the bonjour name it'll have, which is fine. You can disable things you're not going to need, like the Zigit if you're not using DFS, or AppleTalk. And we can go back to the volumes themselves, and for homes, we can use this volume as a home directory. And so it, by default, will also use access-based enumeration to prevent other users from seeing home folders that are not theirs. Chris?
Question or two about ExtremeZ-IP Spotlight at Windows Server.
Yeah.
Is to be a little cynical about it, is ExtremeZ-IP the answer to the question, hey, I lost my Spotlight searching when I went to a Windows server? And I want to get the content searching back for Macintosh clients.
The question is ExtremeZ-IP the answer to the problem of losing your Spotlight ability when you're connecting to a Windows server? And the short answer is yes, because it does allow you to index a volume, and it will allow Spotlight to return results on that volume. So
I guess the implied corollary question is there no way to get a Mac to leverage Windows search services directly?
Good question. I'm not sure that necessarily is the same language potentially between Spotlight and Windows Search Service. So I don't think so. Unless Windows Server decided to implement a Spotlight-friendly indexing, which is what Spotlight checks. It checks the index itself. So what ExtremeZ-IP is doing is essentially indexing the files in a way that Spotlight can read them from that index file, that V100 file or whatever. So unless Windows Server starts doing that, yeah. Yep.
Does that all change the home folder in that I don't know if that's going to be your users folder when they automatically log in?
Not based on the settings that I chose earlier, which is to use the profile as the home folder. If I use the username as the profile, I still have to go tell AD where I want the profile located.
So does that all affect like from the time or off site they log in, taking it back into it to give it all the time connect to that home folder when they actually do?
You mean for portable home directory, like mobile accounts? Well, for mobile accounts, it's different because what you can do is you can configure it in two places. You can either go, and we'll show that in the Mac AD client, but you can force the home directory to be on the local disk, in which case it creates a mobile account. Or from AD itself, you can actually specify that the path to the home folder will be /user/username, in which case when the user logs in, that's where it creates the home folder, but it doesn't create a mobile account. So you have to be careful about that, because you can have a quasi-network account in the sense that it's authenticating to AD live, but it has a folder stored on the local machine. So if it goes off-site with that particular setup, it's going to be looking for the AD server to authenticate. But if you've created the requirement for a local account and cached credentials, then it can still authenticate. The challenge is with domain spaces that are resolvable publicly, where it'll try to look for the AD server on a domain name that exists and that can be routed. So what some people do is that they'll use split DNS to manage that kind of thing. they'll put the server subdomain name in their internal DNS, but not in their external DNS. So when the client outside the network tries to resolve the domain name, corp.yourdomainname.com, it'll not be able to, and it'll just default to the local cache credentials. Yes?
I'm just looking at that real quick. So 25 users, two grand. Is this the only real solution for flooding Mac?
No, the reality is we could do it without ExtremeZ-IP, and we just use it with SMB, and the AD client allows you to specify SMB as the protocol for the users to connect. You don't need ExtremeZ-IP at all, but we're using it for the functionality of Spotlight, and because AFP is actually faster on the local network than SMB, in my opinion. And in my tests anyways, AFP just has some reliability functions or features that are kind of cool, like resumable downloads, interrupted connections, things like that. AFP handles that a little better for Macs than SMB.
But you're saying this is the reason, in your mind, this is Windows Server and ExtremeZ make sense to go together in both situations?
It depends on your requirement. I'm definitely not trying to advocate for ExtremeZ-IP by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, some of our clients, we're not using that with them because they felt, oh, we don't want to spend the money on that. We don't need to. That's fine. We'll just make do with SMB. And for the most part, it works okay. I think if you have a large user count, you're probably going to benefit from ExtremeZ-IP, or if you want the Spotlight search functionality, you'll benefit. So something to consider. I think there's education prices as well. How many people here from education specifically? A lot.
Very good question.
Very good pricing for education, so worth having a look at anyways. Okay, so we are indexing that volume for search. I like the resetting permissions on move. When people move files from one folder to another, I'd like it to inherit the permissions of that folder they're moving it to. Just makes for smooth issues with permissions. And I think that's really all we need to do other than restart the service. So we'll go into services, and we'll find our ExtremeZ-IP, and we'll restart it.
2012 a little bit better in starting that service all the time?
You mean the automatic service start?
Yeah, because in 2008, that, and it's only the ExtremeZ-IP, doesn't always start automatically.
Well, that may be some other issue with the server, because I have ExtremeZ-IP on 2008 servers, 2008 R2 servers, and I haven't seen that issue where it just doesn't start. But you can configure how they start, so it could be just a configuration issue. The properties of the service.
And it's all set to that.
Yeah.
9 times out of 10.
You know, something I've seen happen a lot is Windows admins are overzealous in removing things they don't recognize. And I've seen situations where, for example, somebody had a FileMaker server on the network, which requires Bonjour to be installed. And then a Windows admin went and saw that server and is like, what's this Bonjour thing? They remove it. All of a sudden, FileMaker stops working. But ExtremeZ-IP requires that as well. And it won't tell you here, but if you look at the registry entry for the ExtremeZ-IP service, it actually will label whether it requires other services to be available before that service will start. So it may be that you're missing a service, or some other service is not starting, or because some other service was not started yet, it couldn't start ExtremeZ-IP. And so that's why when you go later to start it and you start it manually, it works. So what you could do here is just do a delayed start. There's a delayed start option, which may resolve the issue of it not starting. So I don't know, we'd have to look at that situation specifically. No more hands? Okay. So we're almost down to the wire here. We just have very little left. We're going to go back to AD and go back to that NHD test account that we created. And what we're going to do is we're going to, in the profile, we're going to set a path for the home directory. So I'm going to just call it network, and we'll just say AD01 shares homes NHD test. Now, as a result of doing that, the server will automatically create the folder for the home user, or the home folder for that user, or not. Why did it not create it? Oh, ED01. Try that. Just make sure my share is live here. Shares homes. Was I using something else?
Yes.
Oh, gotcha. And HD test. There we go. So now we can check just to make sure it's there. Here it is. So that'll be empty, but when the Mac device tries to log in, it'll actually have that. So let's close that off. And let's hide this guy here. Let's go and look at our network settings. I'm just going to manually point it at the DNS server for now. And just make sure we can do a lookup. Yep, there it is. Let me also do a check on the Windows server to make sure we don't all of a sudden have that other extra DNS record we were talking about before with the RAS. So peek. Doesn't look like it. Okay, let's try to bind. So that's a good sign. If I just type the domain name of the FQDN of the server and it brings up this option, then I know it's at least able to reach it. So there's an error. We don't know what that is. Well, it's probably DNS, yeah. Dig -x. Everything seems to check out. Try that again. Sorry? Oh, good point. Virtual machine. Options. Where's the time sync? No, well, I can get it from the
Oh, there it is. You just passed it.
advanced.
There you go.
So it just hasn't synced it. Oh, no, don't do that. I just quit parallel, sorry. Yeah, I'll just update the time zone. But we're down to the last task, which is just basically to log in as a network user on the Mac. So let's go back here and check. Yeah, probably. We change it manually. 10, 14. Yeah, it's, I guess it's because my Wi-Fi or my network was not working. Well, it doesn't seem to want to take the settings. There, 10, 15.
Today's 9.
Okay, so let's see if that will actually let us bind. There she goes. On the Windows side, it'll stick the machine in computers by default, which is over here. And so we can move that to the correct OU. For the purpose of logging in on the Mac computer, it's irrelevant. And we're just going to change the settings for this real quick, just to make sure the AD plugin is behaving just the way we want. So for instance, what we want specifically is to not force the local home and to use AFP as the protocol. We are going to get a welcome message from ExtremeZ-IP because it's in trial mode, but otherwise it should work just fine. And one of the things I do really quick before I try that is I try the ID command of the user. And great, so now my machine is talking to AD, it's able to see that user account, and I can potentially log in as that account. Notice my hesitancy in saying potentially. So right now, in a second, it'll give me the option to back out of the admin login. There you go. Yay!